Today, we're diving into a really important update in the world of pain medicine. We're talking about the 2025 treatment recommendations for neuropathic pain. These come from NeuPSIG, which is the specialist group of the International Association for the Study of Pain. Now, this is a big deal because it's the first major revision in a whole decade, and it pulls together a massive amount of new research. So let's unpack what all this new evidence is telling us. First things first, I want you to just take in the sheer scale of this work. These new recommendations are built on a deep analysis of 313 different randomized controlled trials. And get this, that includes an absolutely staggering 48,789 participants. This isn't just an update, it's one of the most comprehensive looks at neuropathic pain treatments ever done. Okay, so before we get into the treatments themselves, let's quickly make sure we're on the same page. What is neuropathic pain? Well, the official definition is pain that's caused by damage or a disease that affects the body's somatosensory nervous system. You know, the part of the nervous system that processes touch, temperature, and pain. Getting this right is key to understanding why the therapies we're about to discuss are so specific. So here's our game plan. We'll start with what makes this 2025 update so important. Then, we'll walk through the three main tiers of treatment recommendations. After that, we'll highlight the biggest changes from the old guidelines and wrap up with the most important take-home messages for anyone in clinical practice. So, you might be wondering, why now? Well, the last big update was way back in 2015. Since then, an extra 109 randomized controlled trials have come out. This includes new data on medications and even emerging techniques like neuromodulation. So this new analysis brings together a whole decade of fresh research to give us the most current, evidence-based recommendations possible. To really understand these guidelines, we need to get a handle on two key metrics. First is the number needed to treat, or NNT. This tells us how effective a treatment is. A lower number is always better. The second is the number needed to harm, or NNH. This measures safety, and here a higher number is better. Every single recommendation is built on this balance between benefit and harm. All right, let's jump into the core of the guidelines, the first-line treatments. These are the ones with a strong recommendation, meaning they're the go-to options right at the start of therapy, backed by the most solid evidence for both effectiveness and safety. As you can see right here, we've got three pillars for first-line treatment: tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, SNRIs like duloxetine, and the alpha-2 doublet ligands, which include drugs like pregabalin and gabapentin. What's really interesting is the trade-off you can see in the numbers. Look at the NNT for TCAs, it's the lowest at 4.6, making them the most effective. But their NNH is lower than the alpha-2 doublet ligands, which tells us there's a higher risk of side effects. And that brings us to a really critical point. While TCAs pack the most punch in terms of effectiveness, they come with some serious warnings. The guidelines are very specific about their side effects, things like sedation and anticholinergic effects, which can increase the risk of falls, especially in older adults. On top of that, doses over 100 milligrams a day have been linked to an increased risk of sudden cardiac death, so caution is key. Now for the alpha-2 delta ligands, pregabalin and gabapentin. This chart from the study gives us a good look at their safety profile. The big takeaway is that they're generally well tolerated, which is reflected in that nice high NHN of 26.2. But the guidelines add a huge warning. Combining pregabalin with opioids significantly increases the risk of drug-related death. That is not something to take lightly. Let's move on to the next tier of treatment. Second-line options are recommended for more specific situations. We're mainly talking about localized peripheral neuropathic pain, where a really targeted approach makes a lot of sense. So here, we have topical agents. Now, their effectiveness is a bit more modest. Their NNTs are higher than the first-line drugs, but they have a major ace up their sleeve: an excellent safety profile. Because you apply them right on the skin, they have very few side effects that affect the whole body. This makes them a fantastic choice for vulnerable patients, and the guidelines even suggest they could be used first-line for the elderly or for people already on a lot of other medications. Now we get to the third-line recommendations. These are treatments that are really reserved for specific groups of patients or for when the first and second-line therapies just haven't worked. They come with a weak recommendation, which means we're balancing potential benefits against some pretty significant limitations. Okay, this one is fascinating. RTMS, or repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, presents a really interesting puzzle. This neuromodulation technique actually shows amazing efficacy with an NNT of 4.2. That's even better than the first-line TCAs. So why on earth is it a third-line treatment? Well, it all comes down to the big picture. The certainty of the evidence is still low, plus it's expensive and not widely available. For now, that keeps it as an option for just a select group of patients. When it comes to opioids, the guidelines could not be more clear. They point directly to the ongoing global crisis, with tens of thousands of deaths from prescription opioids in the U.S. alone every year. Because of this, their use is strictly restricted. The recommendation is firm. Only use them as a last resort, for the shortest time possible, and with constant reevaluation, because the risks of misuse and abuse are just too high. So after a decade of new research, what are the biggest shakeups since the 2015 guidelines? This part is all about the most significant promotions, demotions, and rejections we see in this update. There are two changes that really stand out. First, capsaicin cream, which was previously in the inconclusive category, has now been promoted to a second-line therapy. Second, and this is a big one, tramadol is no longer considered its own second-line agent. The guidelines now recognize its opioid action and the risks that come with it, so it's been demoted and is now grouped with all other opioids in that third-line restricted use category. Of course, there's a huge question that comes up all the time in pain management today. What about cannabinoids? What did this massive meta-analysis find out about them? Well, the conclusion is definitive. Based on all the available evidence from randomized controlled trials, the guidelines make a weak recommendation against using cannabinoids. The bottom line is that the meta-analysis just didn't find enough evidence to say they work for treating neuropathic pain. Okay, let's bring it all home. What does all of this mean in practice? Let's distill this down to the most critical take-home messages for clinicians on the front lines. Ultimately, what these guidelines really drive home is that there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Treatment has to be individualized. That means using shared decision-making and considering the patient's entire life, their biology, psychology, and social situation. It's also so important to manage expectations because even our best treatments often have modest effects. And while this update is a huge step forward, it also shines a light on where we need to go next. We desperately need larger, longer-term trials to clear up the uncertainty that still surrounds so many treatments. The real question that remains is, how can we get better at figuring out which patient will respond to which therapy, moving us closer to truly personalized pain medicine?